Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're watching from. I'm Ben Cronin, I'm the editor of Sport Business Sponsorship. Today, as you know, we're going to be talking about women's sport, namely how it can embrace the chance to be a little bit more radical. I'll admit that we were being slightly provocative with that title, and I'm sure some of our panelists will disagree with the idea that radical necessarily always means best. I think what we're getting at is that women's sport has got a chance to do things a little bit differently from men's sport, and carve its own path and try new things. To discuss the subject, I'm joined by Kaylee Grieve, who's Senior Marketing Manager for UEFA. She's had a leading role in creating UEFA's Women's Football Partner Programme. We're also joined by Jessica Smith, who's the Head of Revenue for the NWSL's most commercially successful club, Angel City FC. On the brand side, we've got Kate Verono, who is Head of Women's Sport for Zwift, which is a virtual training platform, in case people don't know that already. And finally, on the agency side, we've got Lisa Parfit, who's co-founder of the Space Between Agency. So as we said in the marketing, this event coincides with the publication of our Women's Sport in Numbers report, which takes a deep dive into the economics of women's sport and provides detailed information about sponsorship deal valuations in the sector. And I'll be trying to share some of the graphics from that report as we go along. And if you want to pose some questions to our panel, please use the Q&A function running along the bottom. I'll try and keep tabs on what you're asking as we go along, and try and get the panelists to field those. Okay, so this is going to be a test of my ability to multitask. Jess, I was going to share my screen and one of the slides from the report. We found, or one of the things that was very interesting to me was that Angel City account for 20% of the attendances in the NWSL, which I thought was a staggering number. What is it exactly about the fan experience there, and what you've been able to do that is driving that?
Yeah, and I think you'll see a tremendous amount of growth from many clubs this year. Really what Angel City had the opportunity to do in year one is we resourced and went to sell out our games, right? We built a ticketing product, right, that was exclusive when it came to the premier seats, that had everything that you would expect from the top opportunities that you'd see in Los Angeles. But then we also catered to creating an experience that's really like for us is we've had a chance to build a community. When you look at the demographics of our fans, it's not the same as the traditional sports fan, especially here in the United States. So really what we have is a unique consumer that's looking to rally behind something that they believe in. And with women's sports, there's an incredible opportunity to bring the world together and be a part of equity in this world, and knowing how consumers now understand that they're part of that solution by buying a ticket, by buying merchandise, by tuning in for ratings, by supporting the partners that support their teams, their leagues, et cetera. The opportunity was there and ours for the taking. So we were able to build a product catering to that mindset, but also staying true to why we exist in the first place, which is to create equity in this world and do that through sport. So our game experiences, it sounds incredibly cheesy, but when you're there, it truly feels like you're going to change the world. When you're sitting in our seats beside the folks beside you, you know that you're beside allies in that fight towards equity. And it is an incredible fan experience from a sporting perspective, watching some of the best footballers in the world. And at the same time, you know that there's a reason behind buying that ticket and sitting in that seat. So our game days are really something that have to be experienced, which is what you're looking to do. I have to say, while game days super important to us, of course, we want that can't miss opportunity in Los Angeles. And of course, you may see celebrities like Natalie Portman or the 14 former U.S. women's national team members that are part of our ownership group. It's really just phase one of Angel City in what we are looking to build on a global scale.
Yeah, and I mean, you said, yeah, on a global scale, and merchandising is a very sort of important part of that, and also sponsorship, which we'll come on to later. I'm interested in how that sort of differs, that sort of US model versus the European model. And I'd like to ask Kaylee, is that something you think sort of fans of women's football in Europe are sort of buying into sort of a bigger sort of movement, and does that sort of play into the match experience, do you think?
It's an interesting one for us, because I think when we set out, maybe there was an illusion that there was, for us in Europe, this new audience that we could bring in under that kind of banner. I think the reality that we found is that it's because football in Europe is so big and it's so popular and there's so many fans of it. The reality is that the audience that we attract is that audience, but with maybe a different hat on when they come into our events. So maybe they have a slightly different persona when they arrive at women's football versus how they behave and what they expect at a men's game. So certainly our TV audiences, our digital audiences, they're getting more balanced, but they are still significantly more followed by men. And those men are football fans. So it's a very, very small percentage of our audience in Europe for women's football who are, and it's almost negligible, who are not fans of football per se and are not engaged in men's games. So I think that maybe is a slightly different thing. And to be honest, I think if we were honest with ourselves, maybe a little bit under the illusion that we were going out to find this new audience, this new elusive audience to bring to the game. So we have pivoted slightly as we've learned more about who is interested and how we do it. From a fan experience perspective, though, there's definitely a different way that we deliver the matches, and I think it's a little bit more joyful. It's a little bit more family friendly. So dads who might come to men's England matches, for example, if we take the Women's Euro in the summer, might go to that game less with family, more with friends or supporters clubs, etc., whereas might decide to bring family, kids, etc. to the women's game, which means they kind of come with a slightly different persona, as I mentioned, and they maybe come expecting a different thing from that. So when we looked at the Euro in the summer, for example, like our whole match experience was quite a lot built around music. Even after the games, it's very small things sometimes, but just making sure that we had playlists from each of the associations to make sure that the after game experience extended a little bit further. And it was a really interesting, I don't know how many of you saw it, but with the England team in particular, there was a really interesting commentary around how long the girls stayed celebrating on the field after games, because until they won the competition, they hadn't won the competition. And there was a slightly old school mentality of, oh, they shouldn't be celebrating already. They've not won the tournament. Why are they spending an hour celebrating with the fans, in a group stage match, etc. But I think also people are a bit like, well, actually, it's kind of working and it's kind of giving the fans that extra feeling. It's extending the experience. It's making it more memorable. It's getting more people involved. And actually, is it doing any harm? So I think we challenged, I'm not saying a lot of what we did was revolutionary or completely different. It was just angled slightly different, and it was thought about from how do we make this experience as long as possible, as engaging as possible? And how do we just challenge a few of the perceived norms of what football has to be kind of accepted or, legitimate in that sense? And I think that definitely came off.
Yeah, that crossover is totally different here in the US. Like even sharing a venue, we only see 10 to 15% of the same fan coming to the matches across the league. So it's a total different consumer, which is its power here for sure, but interesting to see the difference.
I think that's the thing. We had you guys over in the summer during the Women's Euro as well, learning a bit. And that's the thing, like we're so desperate to share stories and find out, but there is, I think, quite significantly different markets in that respect. But we're also just learning a bit about ourselves. I think, there's a benefit to it as well. You mentioned the crossover for our Women's Champions League. When we move into the big men's stadiums, the audiences are 10 times, 20 times bigger because the fans come. They know that experience. They come, whereas the same fans won't go to the smaller stadium that the women play at, etc. So, yeah, it's quite different, I think, from that respect, at least.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's maybe more of an opportunity. Well, it's perhaps easier in the US because there's sort of a bit more sort of new territory to be carved out, but there is a little bit of a sort of, the sort of established football traditions. I was interested what you say about the applauding after games. It's sort of, it's just expected that you don't jinx it, I suppose, in men's team I sort of over celebrating, but yeah, why shouldn't, you know, if it sort of creates a family-friendly atmosphere and everyone's enjoying themselves, why shouldn't they actually, you know, get into it and actually celebrate properly? Okay, I want to ask you, Kate, about the sort of Zwift sponsorship of the Tour de France Femme. I mean, that's a very distinct event. How did that, first of all, come about? Because I understand it was almost inspired by COVID, or it came about as out of necessity, and
Yes.
that sort of enabled it, you know, the event to sort of carve its own path, if you like.
Yeah, this is a pretty wild story. So Zwift, we're a virtual platform. We have gamified fitness. So you can basically ride your bike in a virtual world indoors. And over the pandemic, while everything was shutting down outside, races and riding, Zwift's platform was growing extensively, and we have competitions on Zwift as well. And when we started competitions on Zwift, because we have this virtual world that we can literally build the worlds of cycling that we want to be a part of. When we did start competitions, we always had complete parity across the board, equal opportunity, equal broadcast, equal prize purses, equal distance for women and men. And over the pandemic, races were paused. The Tour de France was paused. It was going to be postponed until later in the year. And so you had fans all around the world and riders all around the world just desperate for action. I mean, the bike racing season, you know, I'm watching races every weekend. It's just a big part of it. And with a big question mark on when the Tour de France was actually going to happen, we put our heads together with ASO, the organizing institution that puts on the Tour de France, and said, you know, let's do a virtual version and we can broadcast it all around the world. So we did that. And because it was in Zwift, we played by Zwift rules, which was complete parity. And that was broadcast in July of 2020. And we had 6 stages, men and women, and it was broadcast in 130 countries, and over 16 million people viewed it. And the women's racing was actually even better than the guys racing. I think they saw this opportunity to take the world stage, and that fans were watching, and they had this incredible opportunity to be seen. And they brought the action, and the viewership was off the charts. And that's what kicked off the conversation with us and the ASO. To do this for real. It is time for a proper women's Tour de France. I mean, many people don't know the race started in 1903. There's been a few women's versions over the years, but they kind of paled in comparison and fizzled out almost immediately. So this was an opportunity for a sponsor to get behind the race, after kind of a proven partnership. And we launched the Tour de France Femme avec Zwift. We signed on as a 4-year partner, and the race launched last July of 2022.
And do you think you were able to do more with that event than you would have been able to do with the men's event?
Oh, yes, absolutely. This was being the inaugural year of, the world's biggest women's race. There was so much incredible attention around it. The riders are incredibly accessible, and they are very excited to be seen by the world. And so you feel like you can really connect with fans, you can connect with the athletes. And because this is the women's tour, it's not quite the same price tag as the men's tour. But you can imagine the PR around the first year was just off the charts. So it was an incredible opportunity for us to put our brand behind it, to kind of be an extension of this commitment to, elevating women's cycling that we started years ago, and take that to the highest level of the sport in hopes of creating the next generation of champions and turning the world on to how incredible women's racing is.
Okay, and we'll come back to maybe the sort of, some of the sort of technological innovations that you were able to do, and sort of, sort of funky things that you were able to do with that property. Lisa, I want to talk to you a little bit about sponsorship and sort of segue into sponsorship. And we talked about sort of cultivating family-friendly atmospheres there and doing things differently. That creates a certain type of pressure as well, doesn't it, about the, to sort of eschew sponsorship deals with certain types of brands. I'm thinking of, events like the 100, where the ECB actually sort of explicitly said they weren't going to go after the same old financial sector brands, because they're trying to sort of cultivate this new sort of family-friendly environment. Do you think it's important for women's sport to sort of have a sort of distinct position on certain types of sponsorship deals?
Yeah, I do. I think it comes with challenges because women's sport, or many women's sports, are, commercially more stretched. There's still more development to be done. There's a great deal of pressure in terms of bringing the revenues in and increasing and growing the revenues of women's sport. And that is a distinct conflict with, bringing in partnerships. And when you get offers for partnerships with brands, you need to take them all very seriously. Every penny counts towards the innovation and the change and the development. However, women's sport, many women's sports are very different. They are not social causes on their own. However, women's sport is quite distinct and quite different in that many of them take a very clear position on social causes and on purpose. They also have an audience, and we found that through our own research on the women's sports fan compared with fans of men's sport, is that you have got an audience that is predominantly more purposeful. You have an audience that is more likely to care about gender equality, about fairness, about community, about social inclusion. So when you start to bring all those things together, whilst you've got the pressure of bringing the commercial revenues in, you have an audience that really does care about the brands that you align with, and they are very careful about the brands that they purchase and they align with. And you've also got the fact that, many women's sports properties, and Jessica will know this, will be very clear as to what their position is on societal issues and what they stand for. And therefore, taking the first gambling brand that, comes to you for a shirt or jersey sponsorship is just not going to align. And I think, at the end of the day, success plus social good can coexist, and that can bring those commercial stresses and pressures. But I do think it is really, really important that women's sport, we're at a kind of an earlier stage in this, and I think we have to be really careful that we don't go down the wrong route. We have more family audiences. We have an audience that's much more purposeful. So I think we have to be really careful. I think if you look at Lewes FC as one really good example, who, a few years ago when they came out very clearly with their positioning around Equality FC and the great things that they're doing in terms of investing in the men and women's teams, and their really clear, purposeful angle is, they did not sign up with gambling brands. In fact, they went the opposite way, and they put a charity that supports families that have been, who have been impacted by, gambling, on their front of their jersey. So they absolutely went the opposite way, and that's the right thing for them to do, the right thing for their audience, and it's the right thing for their brand going forward, if they're going to stick authentically to what they stand for.
Yeah, and we share a slide in the report where we talk about the benefits. I mean, in the case of the WTA, they took a very strong stance on the Peng Shuai affair. And soon afterwards, they agreed that their $20 million title deal with Hologic, and that was we understand that was very influential in why they secured that deal, and that actually allowed them to triple their annual sponsorship revenue overnight. So it shows that that does pay. Having sort of taking a sort of strong stance on things can pay, and also given that sponsorship makes up the largest share of revenues for women's sports properties, then perhaps it's more important to take these sort of stances than it is in men's sport. I was going to come to you, and also just stay on that subject. You have this this position where you donate 10% of sponsorship deals, if I'm right, to community-based causes. Do you want to just expand a bit on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Angel City came to fruition, right, the team is based in purpose, in creating equity in this world. That said, we want to be an entity, and every decision we make is an entity that balances mission and capital. Us being successful, us being profitable is actually the best thing we can do to ensure that more investment continues to flow through the women's game at all levels of the organization. And while we want to make sure we're driving with purpose, because that's who we are at our core and authentic to who we are, we also don't want there to be a perception that we are charity in any way, shape, or form. Like, it's the right thing to do, but it's also an incredible business case, right? So when we thought through monetizing, when I sat down and thought of the brand that Angel City was and how we were going to monetize that on the partnership front, I've been sitting in these rooms for 20 years with these incredible brands and putting together partnerships. And there's always been an opportunity to take it a layer deeper. At its core, what partnerships are the affiliation and trust between brands. It's the use of marks and logos is the highest sought after entity within any LED time or program that you would put together. And so at Angel City, what we're aligning with our partners, and to your point, Lisa, is our value set. So when you partner with Angel City, you're telling the world immediately that you believe in equity and everything that we stand for. So for us, as an organization that believes in that, it was really important that we, what I call, like, we're in a soapbox organization, where you sit on a soapbox and you talk through, like, we need to make sure we're providing more pathways to women for coaching opportunities because there's not enough in the pipeline, or we need to make sure we're supporting the LGBTQ community, or we need to make sure we're supporting Los Angeles and food insecurity during COVID. Those are all very real things, but without resource and money, we shouldn't necessarily just be talking about those. So the way that we formed, our mindset was really, there's a way for us to do this together at all times and really walk the walk of our beliefs and make sure we're making systemic change, not just talking about the realities of those besides sport in real time. So with that came the 10% model, where 10% goes into our pillars of equity, essentials, or education. For us, equity, certainly pay equity, but equity for us is also ensuring we're supporting people of color, the Black community, the LGBTQ community, those with disabilities, really anybody that needs a level playing field. Essentials for us, the essential of sport is transformative. All of us are here, through a variety of that reason, whether it's safe places to play, equipment to youth. You look at the data behind women specifically having access to sport. It's something we want to make sure we're taking part in, but essential is also about building a whole human being, right? Making sure you're thinking through safety, mental wellness, food security, housing security, et cetera. And then education for us, which is certainly using our platform to talk about those pillars that I just shared, but also making sure that we're using our platform, to provide information, to a community that's looking for it at all times through honest conversations, and not steering away from the fact that we're still not at a place where we have a women's game where people can feel safe and celebrated around the globe. And like, how are we all a part of shifting that? So when we walk into the room with partners, that's what we talk about our pillars and who we are. We say we're going to change the world. We would like them to do that with us. And then, of course, on the side, they're getting LED and incredible social programs and content, et cetera. But I fully agree with Lisa. We've had to walk away from many conversations with brands that looked at us as a PR hit. Candidly, they were in a little bit of trouble somewhere, like, well, we should go do this partnership with Angel City, or brands that candidly just don't align with our values, that we're not worth the risk for the greater good.
I think that's really interesting, Jessica, because a lot of the brands that are coming into sponsorship, obviously they're aligning with passions and they're aligning something that's got visibility, and it's really interesting, but they're also looking for proof points. And so I think that 10% model is really, really interesting, because you're effectively giving them purpose and proof points where their money is actually delivering real difference and real change. And a lot of the big rights holders can do that through participation programs, but there's only so many. And I think brands are looking beyond just the sports aspect of it and the participation aspect. There's definitely looking at social mobility and purpose and sustainability and all of those things. So I think those built-in proof points and showing where the money is actually going to make a difference as well is definitely the future of those commercial models.
And we've all been in those spaces sitting down at renewal time, right? Every brand shifts over those years, but when you sit down and the first thing you say, so Birdies, for instance, I love using that example because they're a women's fashion brand, which is great that we've been able to welcome them into sports sponsorship. We provide an internship program for diverse young high school students because we view college as a barrier to entry to both sport and fashion. So like, we provide that experience to them. We can't wait to look at that in 3, 4, 5 years with that alumni from that group and to see where those incredible humans are now, right? And what they're doing. That's one example, one proof point. Or DoorDash, you sit down, you talk about the millions of people that you've had an opportunity to feed. It's just sport is always a reflection of our society at any given moment. So it's incredible to see, I think, it start to take this shift.
Katie, would you say that's this sort of similar thinking behind the We Play Strong campaign and the I forget the name of the Disney campaign, the UEFA Playmakers campaign? They were very much about participation, weren't they?
Yeah, I think when we set out, so we back in 2016-17 is often the moment we talk about when we unbundled our sponsorship rights and the commercial model for UEFA's women's football programme was born. But at the very same time, we were clear that the participation in the game just wasn't growing fast enough, and that really needed a base. And coupled with that, to ask partners to come in and buy into something, we really had to showcase that we were putting our money essentially where our mouths are, as well as a governing body with, you know, good revenues flowing through it. You know, you're not going out cap in hand asking other people to come in and build this thing for you. So essentially that was the We Play Strong piece was more of a movement builder at the start. It's evolved over the last few years into something slightly different now, but it's set out, very much to try and drive that message of getting girls playing football, building something with our federations all around Europe, to grow that message. And I think we were probably in the past working alongside the trends of movements in gender equality, and I don't think we'd ever really put ourselves to the front of the queue and said, okay, hang on, we'll use our brand, we'll use our voice, we'll use our programs to do something about this and drive it. I think from a women's gender equality perspective, that was the first time we had a vehicle to stand out and say, okay, we're talking about it, we're doing something about it, and we're bringing partners in to support that. And it kind of came in that three ways. So it was a good opportunity to do that. Over time, that platform has become quite commercially interesting, because then we grew an audience of young girls and women who play the sport across Europe into, again, a kind of social community that we grew over time with a lot of content that went alongside it. And actually, in our contract renewals, that access and that ability to speak to those audiences became really interesting to commercial partners, many of whom could probably speak to a lot of those audiences through their men's properties if they had them already bought up with us, but not with the tone of voice, not with the credibility or the authenticity that this platform then allowed for. Playmakers, We Play Strong was much more in that kind of teenage girl, making sure the dropout of football was tackled, because we had some strong insights to show that 12-13 age was when we were losing most of the girls out of the game. But as that started to establish itself, we also recognised that we had to feed the funnel as well. So Playmakers with Disney was our first attempt at rewriting how you deliver grassroots participation, not just the marketing side of it, but fundamentally that programme is built on something completely different than what any football programme has done before. We looked at the research of what girls like when they do sport participation, and we used that to build the foundation of the programme. We worked with Disney to build the credibility and talk to the mums and, you know, who didn't really have a relationship with us. It wasn't about getting princesses in front of girls. I mean, that was probably the biggest PR challenge, to make sure it wasn't just seen as that, as a kind of lazy attempt to get girls interested. Okay, we'll partner with the princesses and that'll make it happen. It wasn't that at all. In fact, the franchises we worked with were The Incredibles first. Okay, then we went into Frozen 2, but it was such a big franchise that we couldn't miss that opportunity. But like I said, I think that what we are looking at now is how, when we start building programs for girls, let's not take off the shelf what we do for boys and just rebrand it or recolor it and put it back out there for girls. It's really getting to the crux of what do they want from this program, what does it have to look like, what do they enjoy, and learn from them and build something that's very much built for them for this age as well. Sometimes we question, actually, sometimes I think boys would quite like this approach now as well, whether it's it's quite so different, but ultimately we're putting girls at the heart of this program and developing it that way. And like I say, a partner like Disney has a good role to play in that, and helping us storytell around it and giving us the characters and the franchises. The fundamental research piece was that children learn best through storytelling, and we don't really have stories or characters. We can build them, but not really our forte. So partner with somebody who is exceptionally good at that was kind of the strategy there.
Yeah, so authentic, and but also something that appeals to sponsors, because it's a way of sort of connecting with that audience. Okay, Kate, I wanted to ask you just how important social purpose is as a brand. You know, does that matter as much to Zwift, or is there also, just be careful how I ask this is it also just, you know, about getting people to use your technology? Is tech integration almost the most important thing for you?
Well, I think, you know, we feel like if we grow the entire sport, we're going to grow, you know, the community that's using our product. So it's a win-win for us to get behind something like the Tour de France Femmes avec Zwift, because what it does is it, you know, kind of creates this temple where there's, you know, now the whole world can kind of can aspire to, or sorry, not aspire to, the little girls can aspire to, but the whole world can kind of see just how big women's racing can be, and it can inspire a lot of participation around the world. And that's a big part of our partnership, is just wanting, you know, to just elevate the sport and just make more people aware of the different levels of the sport. It's been a traditionally very male dominated sport. But women's riding and racing has grown exponentially, especially in the past 5 years. Over the pandemic, there's been a lot of data from things like Strava, which is, you know, the online endurance community, that showed how much more women, you know, the participation for women cyclists and runners grew even at a faster rate than men. And we saw the same thing on our platform. So it is, you know, it's definitely a big part of it. We just want to see more women on bikes, and that's going to, you know, put more women on Zwift. But it's also just, it's been this unique opportunity of our platform, you know, having this virtual world that we could, you know, design it the way we want, and we could make it more inclusive and more accessible than the sport has traditionally been. So the partnership with the Tour de France was just sort of a natural evolution of that commitment to, you know, to investing in growing women's cycling.
Yeah, and there's a virtuous circle there where you're sort of increasing participation, yeah, and you actually sort of, yeah, you deliver bigger audiences, which deliver, you know, more eyeballs for sponsors. Okay, I'm going to share another, try and share another slide here. So Lisa, this is actually from a study by your agency, The Space Between, which is about there's a different sort of profile for your sort of typical women's sport fan, and their affinity towards the brands that sponsor women's sport. Do you want to talk us through this?
Yeah, so the research itself, it was pre last summer, so it was before the big kind of women's football moment last year. But the research, just behind the research, was, I suppose, probably a bit of a frustration, still like lacking the amount of women's sport, or how much women's sport was being used in marketing, but also that there was this kind of narrative around, well, when it gets big and when it grows, then like that's when the value will come, which gave off the idea that it wasn't valuable yet. Now, obviously, reach and visibility has increased significantly since then. But the reality is that we wanted to look at the audience itself and look at the value of the audience. And we had this kind of gut feeling that actually there was a real difference between the collective women's sport fan compared to the men's sport fan. Now, what we know is that they're equally gender, you know, 50% men, 50% women. But what we saw was just real significant differences when it came to how they thought about brands sponsoring their sports, and their values as well. So when you look at women's sports fans in comparison to men's, and the stats for the men's sports fans aren't on here, but this graph here just shows you how much stronger affinity they have towards the brands that are sponsoring women's sport. And in comparison, you know, the same responses to men's sport fans towards sponsors of their sport is so much less. It's so much smaller, than much less likely to be engaging or purchasing the brand compared to women's sports fans. And what sits behind this really is just demonstrating how women's sports fans really appreciate and understand the investment that brands are putting into women's sport. They have, you know, probably followed women's sports. They really acutely understand and are aware of the lack of investment. They will have a passion for there being more investment into the sports that they love. And therefore, the brands that have come in, they are far more likely to kind of speak really positively about them. And there is a far greater intent to purchase than you have with men's sports fans. And that's purely because it's a far more developed commercial model. It's a far more cluttered environment. There is an acceptance. You will have a lot of sponsors on a backdrop and on your LEDs. And over time, you know, and those sponsors will have to work a lot harder to engage with that audience. So there were some really distinct differences, and it just goes to show, whilst the audience for women's sport may not yet be there in terms of parity of scale and size for as men's sports, the value is really, really, really strong. And actually it means you've got a lot less wastage. You know, men's sports fans, you know, you're not just necessarily going to always be able to reach everyone. And there's going to be quite a lot of wastage with your target audience, but we think there's a really, really, really important narrative as to how valuable women's sports fans are.
Yeah, so it's qualitatively different, and there's an opportunity there to sort of gain first mover status. And I think that's, you know, what Visa have done in a lot of cases. You know, they've sort of secured the UEFA women's football partner rights, and the FIFA. I think they were the first mover in the case of the FIFA deal as well. Jess, is that something that you found about your audiences? Actually, just before I ask the question, just quick reminder that if you want to ask a question of the panel, please just pop it in the Q&A, click on the Q&A button and pop it in the chat alongside. I'll try and get them to answer it. So Jess, I was asking about the sort of do you sort of pitch your sort of sponsorship proposition saying, you know, this is a qualitatively different audience?
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have case studies to show that it is, even in Los Angeles. I think the misconception is that a soccer fan in the US is a soccer fan or a football fan, not American football. And we had a day last year where we sold out a match the same time the Galaxy, one of the LA MLS teams, sold out a match. At the same time, there were over 80,000 people watching Juventus and Real Madrid, all within 10 miles of each other. And that was the exact example that we give of that folks that are going to go see Juventus are probably not an Angel City fan, right? And we've built and it's not just, oh, I like soccer and I'm just going to go to any soccer match. They're really looking for specific leagues, players, et cetera, that they like to follow. And for Angel City, we're also in a unique, you know, place where I think the opportunity for women's sports also lies, is that it's not just sport, it's sport and purpose and pop culture. And it's a mix of those things that draws in a consumer at any layer, whether it's a ticketed event, ratings, social media following, et cetera. So we certainly play on that to the way you phrased it, in that we're building a product based on those differences and actually purposely not building the same thing that the men's teams have just because it's been done and been successful for them, because that's great, but it's a totally different consumer. So you have to ask yourself the 3 other questions, you know, in those processes to make sure that you're really giving them what they're looking for and not just, you know, a cut and repeat of something that they've seen elsewhere.
Seen already before. Yeah. Kaylee, I'm interested in the sort of the exposure piece, you know, are we trying to get to this sort of position where it isn't just about IP and about values? Is that the sort of the end point, or do you think sort of women's sport can actually sort of exist in its sort of current form? You know, I mean, in the case of women's Euro, you're already getting the eyeballs, aren't you, when you're getting the exposure?
Yeah, I think, but like I kind of mentioned at the start, our biggest challenge really around this is clear space in the football calendar for a European football fan, because Women's Euro does do well because it's carved out. There's a space in the summer. That's the sport that's on. That's the event that's on. Everybody can tune in. They've got the capacity for it. What we struggle a little bit more with Champions League, Women's Champions League, is just with all the men's football, the saturation of men's football through the weeks and through the season, finding space for that to breathe in its own and to be accessible to fans who, like I say, if they're already a men's football fan who are coming more over to women's football, that's great. And if they can come, they might, but it's not yet the point where we're the first choice in that sense, or if we're competing, we find it a lot harder. So I think that's a clear challenge for us on our side, as to how do we carve out this space for the game on an ongoing basis. And it's the same for the domestic leagues across Europe as well. How do we find that point of differentiation, like Jessica described so well, with with what their club are doing, that I think we find that certainly a lot harder, mostly because the clubs who are investing now, at least in many of the women's clubs, are men's clubs as well. So, you know, there's a different dynamic there as to what you create. You've got this clearly ready-made audience there that you want to make something that appeals to them. Sometimes that then restricts possibly our thinking and our creativity around what we do, because it's just, there's a kind of low-hanging fruit over here. We go after that first. We can make huge strides from where we are just now just by targeting on that audience, but at the same time we're kind of creating a little bit of the same again, but smaller maybe. So I think that's our biggest challenge across Europe now, is that we've created a really solid foundation for ourselves, but how do we get the club game, what shape do we put it into to make it stand alone, not just be the baby sister all the time, but acknowledge that we have a very different football culture, heritage and shape in Europe that is a little bit different, and we do have to work around that to some extent. So yeah, I do see the sponsorship side. Right now we're pretty heavily reliant on that, plus internal funding or crossover funding from other competitions and other channels. We do need more from the media rights side, more exposure. We've got some interesting deals with Women's Champions League with DAZN as a almost global partner, being in the MENA region. And the DAZN YouTube partnership within that, which allows for most of the games to be free on YouTube and accessible. That's great, but we also then are, you know, trying to get people into a behaviour pattern where they'll go to those channels to watch those games. So the audiences that we're getting there are super valuable because they're so engaged. They're willing to go and seek it out, find it, watch it on a channel that's not just turning your TV on to your usual sports channel and seeing what's on that day. So we know we're building something really valuable there, but maybe not as fast in some respects as you could. So it's interesting as we go along. I think we've had a huge run for a few years, and you know, we've got ourselves into delivering a big Euro, reformatting Women's Champions League, and the leagues have, as you know, Lisa was mentioning earlier a little bit, and it is in the report, the leagues are starting to see the benefit of that this season now, with the increase in attendances and the kind of halo effect of the Women's Euro, which we hope to see. Now we need to think about what's the next stage, I suppose, for how we grow further.
And it's almost the case, well, it's the reverse in the women's game, isn't it? Because the national team football is bigger than club football, whereas you'd argue that in the men's game it's the other way around. Does that create any opportunities for you, you know, in terms of sort of radical thinking, sort of new formats?
I think more than anything, like I said, just it allows us a space and a calendar to showcase the game at its very best. So yes, it gives us a chance to have that spotlight and what we do with it. We can maybe get creative within and try and attract more. We'll know the next venue for the next Women's Euro shortly. So that'll be another chance for us to really build that audience. But 4-year cycles is a long time, and club football really does need to grow within that. So we're pretty confident on where the Euro is. How creative or radical we need to be with it is probably debatable on the basis that it is attractive, and we can see the biggest indicator or the biggest benefit is the free space in the calendar, and that's the biggest challenge on an ongoing basis for the women's domestic and Champions League game.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in. So we've got someone who's messaged us from Botswana. They say, in Botswana, Africa, our biggest dilemma is that we need the funding to grow the women's game. So it's hard for us to be picky when it comes to sponsors and donors and their motives. Any recommendations on that? Who wants to fill? Lisa, you're the agency representative, so what would you say to that one?
Well, in fairness, I'm not sitting at a sport kind of balancing the budget. So I think hopefully I said in my answer earlier, I do appreciate it's a real conflict and it's really, really difficult. I think the thing about women's sport and sport is that it's very easy to think short term. It's very easy to think, how do I get an audience in? Okay, there's a men's football audience over there. You know, how do I get people in? Okay, we'll do this really cheap. We'll make it free for people. Or how do I grow revenues? Okay, well, we've got an offer over here from this brand and they're willing to spend, so let's do it. And that's really, really tempting. But ultimately, I think you have to think about it in the longer term. And I think about how that potentially impacts you, what you stand for, your values, your proposition in the longer term. And it's quite possible that bringing that sponsor in who's got the money but may not align with your values could mean that there are other partners that aren't willing to work with you, in the longer term, or don't see it as the right platform for them because of the values of that particular partner. And there are challenges globally around that. We've seen around FIFA accepting different partners and having different stances on things too. So I do appreciate that it's not an ideal scenario when you're trying to raise the funds and commercialize, and Jessica can talk to this more than I can, but I do think you have to think long term about the implications of those decisions.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And then there's another question here from Norman Tobias, who's saying, how are women's fans changing sports marketing? Kate, can I put that one to you?
Is that Kate or Kaylee?
I wasn't sure. Who was it? Sorry.
Kate, sorry, Kate. So,
Okay.
how,
can you repeat the question one more time? It was.
So how are women fans changing sports marketing?
Well, I definitely see a new opportunities to engage and connect with fans in a different way, on the women's side of things. So, I don't know. I think there's just an opportunity to forge kind of deeper connections to, yeah.
You said that the cyclists there's a different sort of dynamic going on there, where the female cyclists are actually, where they're more accessible, and also they're you said they were more digitally native as well, that they're better at connecting with their audiences, if you like.
Yeah, well, on the women's side of the sport, social media is one of the best things that happened to women's bike racing, because they could kind of control their own narrative and control some of their marketing opportunities and their connection to their audience. And that has created some really wonderful opportunities to really get to know the riders and have a sort of a deeper level of connection to the personalities, and they give a real inside look at what the life of a pro cyclist is, and the challenges and the glory, and it's really fun for storytelling, and allows us to create some wonderful content alongside of it. One of the biggest things that we've done with this Tour de France Femmes avec Zwift partnership is help pedestal the athletes. We want to create the next generation of superstars. And, we like to say that there isn't a Serena Williams of cycling yet. So there's just a lot of opportunity to showcase the characters, the new characters. And that's just something that women's sports has to offer, is just a whole new cast of characters that maybe because they've had to work so much harder for every sponsorship dollar that they've ever gotten, they are, a little bit more willing to connect with fans, to connect with sponsors, and to share their story. So it's been fun to see, for the Women's Pro Peloton.
Ben,
go ahead.
Sorry, go on. I was just going to say, I think what's really, really interesting in working with some of the sports and governing bodies that we're finding is there's a whole new level of segmentation when it comes to women and how women engage with sport. And I can't tell you over the course of my career how exciting that is. From 20 years ago, every single brief was ABC1 male, age 25 to 35, that was the standard brief. And what's really fascinating now is that more women are engaging with sport, and there's a whole raft of segmentation, from women that are really warm, really hot, they're fans of men's sport, now fans of women's sport. You've got women who are sporty, who've got into sport, and that's the way in. You've got women who have got kids who are into sports, and that's their way in. You've got women who are just really support the women's sport movement, and that women's sport has been their way of getting into sport and engaging with sport for the first time, because actually it's way more appealing seeing people like yourself competing on the pitch. But they're much more peripheral, so you can't talk to them in the language of sport. I was talking today about cricket, you can't necessarily say to them the Ashes and they know what that is. And they know that's England versus Australia and it's the biggest rivalry in the game. But you can talk to them about World Cups because they get that, and Euros and Championship. So what's brilliant is loads more segmentation, a lot greater need to understand who they are, where they are in their cycle of engaging with sport, what media, like, are we warming them up to something in 2 years' time, or are we trying to get them to buy a ticket next week? I think that is a brilliant dynamic, Jane. It means that our marketing and marketing women's sport isn't just to women, but because this is a question about how women change in marketing. I think that's really important. And I think another factor of that is more women at more senior levels involved in marketing decisions and kind of calling on this audience segmentation as well, and helping to make the decisions, the right things to do for women, rather than treating women as quite a homogenous group of people.
I think you're so right, Lisa, on that segmentation. Like, even if I look at our men's properties, because I look after the marketing promotions of that side now as well, and how much we've learned from the women's stuff, actually we need to market the men's champions better to women. And so often what we do is like gaming products and fantasy and things, and all these concepts that came up over many years, if we're being very stereotypical, but it works en masse to men who like numbers and stats and want to be the best at that, being able to recall this, that, and the other. And actually that doesn't always appeal to women. So yes, we could create a women's fantasy league game. It probably would get audiences, but it would attract probably more of the same audiences that play men's fantasy. Doesn't mean we won't do it, but we need to know that that's the audience it will attract. Whereas there's women traditionally haven't gamed as much, but now they're starting to game more. So we're trying to get our team to look much more at what gaming products do women like, what are they doing when they're in gaming environments, how can we build football into that space and connect with them. So Women's Euro, we played around with Roblox and for kids, etc. So just trying to actually get out of this mindset of the products and the content that we create being very driven by a male psyche, created by often male content teams, dominant content teams. So that's whether we're talking to our women's football audience or our men's football audience, women are featuring far more in our thinking as to how we engage.
And it's bringing in more revenue across the board for everybody, right? Because it's really showcasing that lifestyle is a part of sports. So you're seeing more, and this is in men's and women's sports, but I think this is opening the door of like certain brands or female focused brands are now taking a seat at the table in sports, because it's really about the fashion collaboration that's going to come out and less about the results, on the pitch or the ice, et cetera. So I think the women's game is not just built for women, but I think to your point, Lisa, is really opening a door to speak to multiple consumers in a different way that we've never seen before.
Multiple consumers in different segments, and that's sort of opening up sponsorship opportunities at the same time. And it was interesting, Katie, what you said about gaming there as well. I mean, we covered the EA Sports deal, the licensing deal, which is a computer game deal. Again, like you say, not trying to be stereotypical, but that sort of, I'd be interested to know if that plays into a sort of female audience having a sort of position on a video game title.
I think that there's definitely, we have to be careful we're not like I say, A, stereotyping, and B, not accepting that industry is also shifting and that there are more young girls growing up gaming. So FIFA is a game that has a significant number of women and girls who play at younger age. So yes, of course, we want to make sure they're represented in the game. And there was that, EA will tell you their journey with that. They have had women in the game for a long time, but I think now the clubs and the leagues coming in and a little bit more focus on that is definitely, timing is probably good now for that based on all the other improvements that have been in the game, as opposed to maybe when they tried before, a bit more ahead of the curve and got some success, but maybe not quite this what they'll achieve now. So there's just different levels of it. I think there's the kind of general gaming like FIFA, it's a more global game, and they'll also be working on their own strategies to get more girls to play, more women to play their games. So it's working together, I suppose, on that side. But you can see the numbers of women gaming generally are increasing, and young girls gaming, but the type of games they play, not necessarily the quizzes or the fantasy or the predictor type stuff or the football manager type stuff. It's a little bit more really into the numbers and the stats. And I always have this anecdote, growing up with a brother 2 years younger, both football daft. He could name every stadium, every transfer deal, every club badge he could recognise. I didn't really have the interest or capacity for that type of stuff, but I was equally as obsessed with football. But his obsession with football was just valued more than mine. So it's getting to that point where all these different consumers and what they value from the sport are seen as more equal, as opposed to, oh, that's a real football fan, and that's just somebody who likes fashion and likes the silly things around it. Like, I think we're trying to shift the narrative around that to be like, no, you're equally important, and actually your love is no less of this game is no less than this person over here who can recite, you know, whatever stats. Great, really interesting, but there's lots of different ways to be a real super fan of the game.
Okay, I'm conscious of time here. I'm conscious that our panelists will need to be getting away, and the audience too. So that's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks to all of you. As I said, the Women's Sport in Numbers report is now available to buy, and we'll be sending a link after the panel with information about how you can get hold of a copy. So I want to thank all of our panelists, Kaylee, Lisa, Jessica, and Kate. It's been absolutely fascinating, and thanks everybody else for joining. Thanks very much.